EdTech Live is sponsored by K12Computers.com, where you can save up to 50% on factory refurbished Dell Optiplex computers, and by TechnologyRescue.com, helping schools reuse existing computer hardware to build state-of-the-art Linux thin client labs at a fraction of the cost of traditional computing.
Hi, this is Steve Hargadon. Welcome to EdTech Live. Today is Thursday, September 22nd, and our guest tonight is Eric Raymond. Welcome, Eric.
I'm glad to be here.
I'm glad to have you here. Can you give me a little bit of background on yourself, and maybe at the same time a short history of the free and open source software movements for those who don't know much about them?
About myself. Well, I sometimes describe myself as a wandering anthropologist and troublemaking philosopher. And one of the consequences of that was that some years ago I helped found what's now called the open source movement, which, depending on who you ask, is either the same thing or an outgrowth of the free software movement. And both of these are about not having secrets, about having higher quality in software and better results by an open process, a transparent process that's very much like the way scientific inquiry works.
I think a lot of people in the education world can relate to that because they come from an academic environment in which knowledge and information are generally shared without constraint.
Mm-hmm.
And aren't a lot of the roots here from people who are working in academic institutions?
Yes, we get a lot of support from universities and educational institutions.
So can you tell me a little bit about the difference between free software and open source software?
Yes, I can. Free software is the older version. It's the old-time religion, one might say. It's the pursuit of a transparent process in software pursued as a sort of moral imperative. The free software movement was founded by a man named Richard Stallman, who decided that software hoarding and not sharing were intrinsically bad things, intrinsically evil, and should be abolished. At the time, he wasn't very interested in the pragmatic argument, that is, whether you got a better product out of a transparent process. What happened was he founded the movement, free software movement, in the mid-1980s, and in the 1990s, late 1990s, as a result of some observations and thinking I had been doing, I came along and said, wait a second, we don't need the moralizing. We can justify doing what we've been calling free software simply on the quality of the results. And I had observed that moral arguments tend to turn people off, especially people who can write large checks. So I tried to persuade the community to make arguments that were more pragmatic and results-oriented, and the label open source is what went with that. That was sort of the center of the new propaganda campaign. And depending on who you ask, this was either a brilliantly effective stroke of marketing or an attempt to sell the revolution down the river to the filthy capitalists.
Well, so certainly, I've invited Richard to come on this show and to participate, and he definitely holds a high sort of standard as to when he will be involved in a project. And until we're in a position to actually be doing everything with free software, he's reluctant to participate with any software that's not free. So he's certainly taking a very principled stand. So tell me a little bit about the phrase open source software. And did you and those who were involved with you coin that phrase, or did it exist beforehand?
We did. The phrase open source has been in use for a long time in the military and intelligence communities to distinguish from a secret source, to distinguish from something you get from spies. Open sources are things like magazines, newspapers, dictionaries, and so forth. The people that I'm associated with were the first people to apply it to software. I did not invent the phrase myself. It was coined by a woman named Chris Peterson, who has helped run the Foresight Foundation, which is the main nanotechnology think tank, for many years.
So if I think about the free software and open source software, one of the first things that occurs to me is that in many ways it really does require both the pragmatic and the philosophical. meaning a lot of the contributions that are made to the open source software movement are made by people who just have a desire to contribute and believe that it's important to have software that's freely available. And at the same time, in order for that software to succeed, it has to pragmatically be competent or usable or better than an alternative. Would that be accurate?
The difference between the movements, to the extent they are different movements, isn't one of working methods or of tools or even really of technical objectives. It's how they talk about what they do. It's mostly a difference of propaganda and marketing.
Well, certainly if I look at the Wikipedia article about you and I look at the Wikipedia article about Richard Stallman, I come away believing that two very different people are involved in accomplishing something of great good.
Interestingly enough, we've known each other for a long time. I first met Richard in the late 70s, and we used to hang out at science fiction conventions together. Our relationship's become rather more complicated since I became famous.
So was that fame largely due to Cathedrals in the Bazaar, or is it related to just your being a vocal participant in the shaping of how the software is viewed?
I'd say most of it goes back to the Cathedral and the Bazaar, that I had achieved a certain amount of prominence inside the development community with an earlier project called the Jargon File.
Well, and what's the Jargon File?
It's a compendium of the slang used by Internet hackers. And I tried to make it encyclopedic rather than just a dictionary. I tried to make it a sort of guided tour of the hacker culture. And it's been quite successful on a number of levels.
Well, tell our audience a little bit about what the title "The Cathedral and the Bazaar" means, and why what message you were giving there.
In that title, I was trying to set up an immediate contrast between centralized, vertically organized development, the conventional way of doing it, and the style which I saw the Linux community developing at the time, which was very horizontal and networked and peer-to-peer. So, Cathedral, vertical architecture versus Bazaar, emergent chaos, markets leading to order.
Has that comparison held up for you over the years? Have you continued to feel like that's an appropriate way to view the two different styles?
Yes, I think it's held up pretty well. And it's probably equally important that a lot of other people have found it a very productive and generative metaphor as well.
So I'm interested in the implications for that. On the cover of the book, at least the version I have, it says, it's a quote by Guy Kawasaki, and he says, "The most important book about technology today with implications that go far beyond programming." So what do you think he meant by that?
Well, he thought that the open source model of software development might have implications for other kinds of engineering, for the arts, for the sciences, even for politics. And, well, he's right, it probably does. I just don't talk about those much because I like to stay where my arguments are strong, which is in software development.
Well, I'd like to come back to that because I think it does touch on education, and especially if there are changes taking place in the world, does it have an impact on how we educate? But let's first talk about the actual use of open source software in schools. What role do you think open source software can play in schools, and how do you think that it can contribute to our educational system?
Same role it plays everywhere else. Open source software can give a level of reliability and assurance to the users that closed source software never will. Part of this is for technical reasons, which is that the transparent process of peer review tends to produce software that simply runs better. But perhaps an even more important issue is that with open source software, you have control. You're not locked in by a vendor who controls when updates will happen, what new features will go in, and extracts lots of money from you.
Well, certainly last week we had a fun interview with the technical director at a school district that is switching to OpenOffice. And from their standpoint, there are a couple of things occurring. One of which is that they're saving, they anticipate saving several $100,000 by making the change. The other is that they actually feel the functionality of OpenOffice is at a point where it's actually a better solution for them than a proprietary program would be. And
right.
they get the benefit of being able to send the students home with the software, so it doesn't put a burden on the students to purchase software.
Right. All of these arguments, the cost arguments and the keeping control of your organization and your operation arguments, are the ones that keep coming up over and over again. Not being locked in is good. Not being on the wrong end of a monopoly is a good thing.
Well, so there's the use of the actual software by students and teachers. Then there's, to me, there's also the question of the teaching of technology or software programs in the schools. And they seem to be separate because you've got software that's used for day-to-day operations, and then you actually will have a program in the school where they're doing technical training. Tell me, one interesting statistic for me has been that Apache, which runs somewhere close to 70% of the world's web servers, seems not really to be taught in schools. Is that just my impression? Have you seen something else, or is in fact that representative of the fact that open source software, while very used in the outside world, is not yet really being used in schools?
Yes, that's true. That's largely true, unfortunately. That's because Microsoft has a tendency to show up at places that are contemplating switching to open source and hand out huge bribes to get them not to do it. Bribes are called donations, but they are bribes.
Well, it does seem that we face sort of an interesting issue because as a society of choice, where we have an economic model that allows freedom of choice and also gives opportunity for individual interests to balance each other, it is interesting that we market software to schools, and because of the fact that that computer software and hardware are actually marketed to schools, it does seem like there's an inherent risk that the marketing dollars speak louder than the actual usage. How do we address that?
By wising up and becoming intelligent consumers. By recognizing that the whole closed source system of production, while I don't think it's morally wrong, is stupid. It's a bad outcome. It leads to bad outcomes for customers and for users. And just don't play that game anymore.
Well, if you have a commercial company that is in a position to use their financial interest to sway decision making, do you just keep plodding along, hoping that over the course of time the awareness level increases, the value and the quality of the software increases to a point where those financial donations of companies don't actually impact decision making?
Well, are you asking from the point of view of somebody in the open source movement, or from the point of view of an educator? From the point of view of somebody in the open source movement, I say what you're describing has worked for us so far, which is simply working to raise people's awareness so that they realize that the money's got kind of a poison on it. From the point of view of an educator, you have to make a decision. What's more important, pulling in the bucks or doing the right thing for your students?
Well, I guess the Apache example for me is one that's very interesting because there's really nobody promoting Apache to schools. Mm-hmm. But if I'm teaching computer science in an inner city and I really wanted to teach a student skills that would give them job opportunities and wouldn't require a lot of investment on their part, I would want to teach them Apache and PHP and MySQL mm-hmm. because they can go out and take an old computer and continue to learn. But there's mm-hmm. nobody really promoting that, and I wonder, what's it going to take?
Well, it's going to take a lot of people like you working at the grassroots to do the promotion. Open source doesn't have a huge marketing organization. All it has is some public influence leaders and a few spokespeople. So there's nothing that's going to match Microsoft's marketing development dollars that's going to show up on your doorstep. Now, one thing you can do is if you want skilled help, if you want people who are very enthusiastic about this sort of thing and are willing to put in hours to help build infrastructure and maybe even teach, let's talk to your local Linux user group.
Yeah, I've noticed that in some cases definitely makes a difference, and in other cases it's hard. And part of that is that the decision-making process at schools doesn't necessarily favor volunteer organizations supporting software. That school boards are looking for the defined ability to turn to a company and say, you're on the hook for supporting us.
Right,
well, let me ask.
That's something we see in the business world a lot, too. That's not by no means unique to education. The strongest argument the closed source firms have left, they've lost all the other ones. They've lost the, well, we're technically better, because they are. They've lost the, we're cheaper, because they are. The strongest argument they have left is, where are you going to go for support? And again, that's a problem for everybody, not just education. And the answer is a mix of local consultants, volunteer help, and the companies that are actually set up to provide support at OS level and up. For example, Red Hat, Linux Care, I think they're still in business. SUSE provides support along with their operating system. And there are lots of individuals out there who would be happy to sell you their hours relatively inexpensively to help maintain these systems.
It does seem like maybe the two will go hand in hand, as there continues to be a little more visibility of open source in schools. And Novell, I think, is doing quite a bit in that area, that there will be then opportunities for people to see a market to provide services, and hopefully the two will grow hand in hand. One thing I keep wondering is why we don't have the equivalent of a Mark Shuttleworth here in this country.
Mark Shuttleworths are wonderful random events. You can't predict when they will happen. You should probably explain to your audience who Mark Shuttleworth is, or should I do that?
Well, so Mark Shuttleworth is an individual who, through the use of open source software in a commercial company, had a great deal of financial success, and is using some of that financial success to help promote open source software. And his foundation actually funds the implementation of open source software in one form in a number, I think, 100 or 200 schools in South Africa. But it doesn't feel as though we have an individual in this country who's taken the same active role in looking to provide that kind of financial support.
As I said, Mark Shuttleworth's are random events. You can never count on them happening. We've found it's necessary basically to organize from the grassroots up.
So let me propose a very interesting a question that I think is going to fall into a very interesting category. I interviewed Larry Cuban a few weeks ago, who's an emeritus professor at Stanford, who argues that the computer has still not really become integrated into our educational system because it's still just too hard a device to use. And if I'm characterizing his argument correctly, that school teachers have an enormous number of things on their plates. They're constantly working with a large number of students. They have very little free time. And to ask them to become proactive in the use of computer technology when the computers themselves are complicated and may or may not be working at any given point in time is really not a reasonable expectation. He gives the example of the overhead projector as being a technology which was very easy for teachers to assimilate into the classroom because it didn't take an enormous amount of effort to figure out how to use it, and it quickly became evident that it made a difference. And his argument is that after the billions of dollars that we've spent on computers, the computer really hasn't become an integral part of education. It hasn't actually transformed education the way we thought it would.
Indeed, it has not. I want to point out, however, that teachers have access to a very valuable resource that most business people do not, which is lots of contact with young people who know a great deal about computers. To solve this problem, teachers need to learn how not to be too proud to learn from their students.
Well, and one of his concerns is, and I agree with you, one of his concerns is that the moment that we place the burden on the teachers to transform the system, that we've misunderstood how decisions get made in educational systems. And I've come away the last few weeks thinking about this, convinced that in order for the computer to really be integrated across the board into classrooms, that we need to produce a computing device which provides the basic functionalities that would make a difference, but is significantly more plug-and-play than what we're used to. And where I want to go with this is to ask a little bit about the comments that you've been in the press about recently with regard to proprietary formats, and to kind of brainstorm a little about the idea that if there were a computer that could be plugged into a classroom that was like an iPod, that just worked.
Stop. That's never going to happen. It's never going to happen in the open source world, and it's never going to happen in the closed source one either. The difference is the closed source vendors will try to con you into believing it is plug and play. We won't. Your objective is not realistic. Not without another couple decades of development of computer science and UI and a wide level of skill in these things.
Interesting. Does the fact that the web browser is beginning to contain a lot of the what would be considered the basic productivity tools provide any kind of an alternate view there?
Sure. I mean, that's probably the direction things are eventually going to go, unified web-like interface for everything. The problem is computer science is a relatively young discipline. We really don't know how to solve the problem that you're describing yet. Some of us pretend that we do. Those of us who pretend are, well, basically lying.
So, in your view, the computer is still complicated enough that it would be difficult to actually produce such a device. And
that's right.
In that situation, it seems that we may end up living with the fact that teachers' lives are so busy that the only way that this will happen is as they continue to have students come in who are so technology savvy that the students actually are going to require or demand a higher level of computer participation than they currently have?
That's the outcome I expect, yes.
Very interesting. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about these students, and I want to extrapolate a little from some things that you have said in your essay. So at one point you say, the hacker culture and its success is posed by example some fundamental questions about human motivation, the organization of work, the future of professionalism, and the shape of the firm. So it seems to me that the open source movement, the combination of internet access, have really dramatically changed the outcome for most people in terms of what they can expect in their lives with regard to jobs. Do you feel that's true?
Well, the one major change is that it's now possible to get a job writing open source software for a large company that wants to fund it. Are you thinking about something more fundamental than that?
Well, I was trying to go even maybe a level deeper, which is that when I grew up, and I'm only a few years younger than you, it felt to me as though a part of my responsibility in school was to learn how to accomplish something no matter what the circumstances I was placed in were. So I don't know what kind of a job I'm going to get after college. I may get a job that's not really in my interest area, but I've learned some basic skills that allow me to think critically and to communicate effectively, and I will use those skills in whatever the work is that I end up being in. And of course, I had friends who knew they were going to be a doctor from early on or knew they were going to be a scientist. But for the bulk of us liberal arts majors, it was a little less clear-cut. Now it seems to me that, as my kids are growing up, the flattening, maybe the long tail effect, if you want to call it that, or the enormous communications revolution allows them to potentially pick and choose an area of interest where it may actually become a vocation, and where they may have more flexibility in actually choosing what they do in their lives.
I think to a significant extent that's true. I don't think it's in any major way a result of the open source movement. I think that's just generally true because the average level of wealth in our society has risen tremendously over the last 4 or 5 decades. It does, however, dovetail with something that the open source movement is teaching us, which is that if you want high-quality work, you want people who are motivated by passion, not by money.
And it seems that in addition to that, there's also an understanding of collaboration that maybe didn't exist when I was in school.
Yeah, it's different than a lot of the social models we have before because it's both strongly collaborative and irreducibly individualist. Nobody can make anyone do anything else. The order that arises has to be spontaneous and voluntary. And that's very, very different from most of our models for how to run an organization or a society.
Certainly seems as though that's going to have a dramatic impact. If I look at politics, even over the last 4 years, it seems to me that the level of dialogue and accountability and desire to have voice in politics has risen dramatically.
Until very recently, I would have said that most of the Netroots politics going on was basically crazy noise. However, there is now one substantial move forward that we've seen, which is the movement for transparency in federal project funding, sometimes called pork busters. This is an internet-based movement that has successfully pressured Congress into passing legislation which sets up a unified database of where all the money goes and who voted for it. And I mean, we saw a lot of journalistic vaporing about huge network impacts on politics in the run-up to the 2004 elections, and well, basically nothing happened. Pork busters, I think, is the first sign that the internet is really transforming our politics.
I certainly feel as though the increased individualization of reporting, blogging, that the ability for many voices to be heard, the sort of consensus dialogue that takes place on Wikipedia, at least for me, it certainly has felt as though I'm much more actively involved and interested in the thought processes behind political decisions than I was 5 years ago, just because of the immediacy of the information.
Mm-hmm. There are lots of things we can know today that we couldn't know before, and that changes our view of the shape of the world.
So, do you see parallels between the open source movement and Web 2.0? Does Web 2.0 really come out of a lot of the roots of open source? Are there similarities in terms of collaboration and then what are the limitations?
Can't answer that question because I don't think I know what Web 2.0 is. I hear a lot of marketing hype, but so far I haven't seen a lot of substance.
Well, I would say that for me, Web 2.0 is the read-write web, and that the next level of that is the actual use of accumulating information, use and accumulation of information that is a byproduct of regular activity that then becomes something valuable. So a good example for me is now seems mundane, but isn't, but Amazon.com, the book reviews, the opportunity for people to suggest other reading material, these things to me all provide something, a richness to the experience of being at the website that exists because of the users of the site.
So I see what you mean. So your view is that Web 2.0 is the web fused with social networking in a very deep way.
Yes, it's made a significant difference for me to go to a site like Amazon.com and to be able to have the value of more than just their listing an ISBN number and a book title, but to actually have information that's been aggregated. You know, one fascinating feature to me is it will say people who came and looked at this book eventually ended up buying the following books. Mm-hmm. And so it leads me in directions that otherwise I wouldn't know to go, and it's very dependent on the actual users participating in on the website, but not in a conscious way necessarily.
Right. Right.
So for me, part of what I see is that a number of these technologies that get classified as Web 2.0, blogging and wikis, seem to have come out of projects that have started as open source projects.
Yes.
And also a lot of what I see in the Web 2.0 technologies that's interesting to me is that they're highly collaborative, either unconsciously or consciously.
And they, although it's not a rule, it's not a law, they tend to be open source as well.
A number of them are. But here's the question I want to ask you. So Tim O'Reilly, who writes a lot about this, has said that a number of these programs, like Google's programs or Flickr, these are not open source programs. Now, they may be open standards, and they may allow for collaboration, but ultimately they're not actually open source, and that the new open source question is actually the user's access to data.
Right.
And I actually didn't know what he meant exactly by that until recently when I started taking my old family history photographs and putting them in Flickr. And
the question is, can you get them back out, and can you get the metadata back out?
It's that metadata, because here I'm putting in all this information about our family and linking these photos together by individuals and or by place or by identifying individuals in specific photos and realizing I'm very much vulnerable here.
Right. There's a lot of value that the website holds on to that you don't have any way to get back out. Well, I'd say this is part of the awareness shift that's going to have to happen. People are going to have to start insisting that they own their data and they have a right to get it back at any time.
Well, and so your hope would be that the consumer actually drives that by saying, I'm reluctant to continue to use Flickr in this way because I could end up in 5 years having put all this time and energy in and not being able to pull it out.
Right.
So I'm going to demand of Flickr that they make a change so that I continue to be a loyal customer.
Right. Who else is going to do it other than the consumer? Do you want somebody to pass a law? Boy, that would be a blunt instrument. I can't see anything coming from that.
And I think maybe Tim's point, and I don't want to misrepresent him, was that he says that we're sort of looking for the next vocal voice to talk about this issue, and that seems to be a good, that would be a good thing as well. But I'm with you. Once my awareness has been raised about it, now I need to send a message to Flickr and say, hey, this is going to be important for me because I'm going to put my dollar somewhere else if someone provides an ability for me to keep my data, because that's critical to me.
So here's the open source way of solving this problem. You jawbone, this is what a techie would do. You jawbone Flickr, and if it doesn't work, you start your own demonstration site of what photo archiving looks when the user can get their metadata back out. And after you collect your first 500,000 users, Flickr starts paying attention and puts in the feature. This sort of thing has happened before.
Well, so it would be interesting to look back in 6 months and see if somebody else cared enough about that to make a difference.
Right.
Certainly, I'm not in a position to do so, but I would be encouraging. So let me raise another possible parallel between open source and what we're seeing in the world. So my family, for the first time last year, watched a season of American Idol. And we had never done that before. And even though the participation in American Idol is limited to a vote that takes place after the performers have sung, there is audience participation. And it seems to me that there's a very neat business model which is evolving where companies are soliciting the input of their users during the process of building a product. And then the product comes out and it's better because the users have been involved in it. And they're more likely to buy it because it will better fit their needs. Now, am I way off base if I see that actually coming partly out of the open source movement?
Yes, I think it's being influenced to some extent by the open source movement. Perhaps not directly, but perhaps because open source has kind of seeped into the zeitgeist in the last 5 or 6 years. It's no longer unusual for me to mutter that I have something to do with the open source movement to somebody who's not a techie and proceed to hear 5 minutes of my own propaganda replayed back at me.
Well, it certainly, from my standpoint, is an enormously positive development, and one that I can see being really a significant change in how we produce products for users, and one I really like. I also see the what you called, I think, the Linux development model, what you described so well in The Cathedral and the Bazaar, and in Wikipedia.
There's a fundamental difference, though.
So describe the difference for us.
Yeah, the Linux development model works. Wikipedia doesn't.
So what don't you like about Wikipedia?
As I said in a New Yorker interview recently, it's infested by moonbats. The problem is it's a good resource for anything where you can put together an encyclopedia entry simply by compiling facts. But wherever opinions or value judgments enter, especially in the area of politics or aesthetics, you tend to get entries being camped on by nuts who think they own them. And unless you have more sitzfleisch than they do, and unless you're willing to get involved in an interminable edit war, you can't fix things. There's a fundamental dysfunction at the heart of Wikipedia, which is that there's no objective check on the quality of the content. This is different from programming because programming always has an objective check. The program runs or it doesn't. It achieves its design objectives or it doesn't. I mean, yes, design objectives are sometimes not rigorously specified, and especially in the area of UI, there's room for aesthetic argument. But there's a fundamental objective check that programming has, and Wikipedia doesn't, and it gives programming teams something to converge on. They can agree when they have a good enough product. In Wikipedia, that's never the case.
Well, so let's separate this out, because I think what you're saying to me rings true. At the same time, I've watched wikis, not Wikipedia necessarily, but individual wikis sprout up around a specific topic where someone kind of shepherds that wiki, and it does seem to get the best benefits of collaboration with a little bit of steering.
Sometimes such resources can be incredibly valuable, but they depend on the quality of the community and effective leadership. You can't simply put a whole bunch of people with opinions together and expect to get a good result.
So that's probably not a whole lot different than an open source program, meaning my guess is that it probably functions in a very similar way.
It's less critically dependent on the quality of the individuals because there's a star to steer towards. You can generally see when you're going in the right direction.
Well, okay, so we've just got a couple more minutes here before we're going to open up for some questions from those who are listening to the Skype cast. I wanted to ask you, at the beginning of the book, you have a quote in memory of Robert Heinlein. And you say, "For the many lessons he taught me to respect competence, to value and defend freedom, and especially that specialization is for insects."
Yes.
So what message are you trying to get across there?
It's a very important one. I've been enabled to do the work that I've done, which has had some pretty major ramifications in software engineering, and as you talked about, lots of other places as well, precisely because I refused to specialize. Precisely because for over 30 years I trained myself to be able to look at problems from multiple different angles using combinations of disciplines that would surprise lots of other people. You can't do that if you over-specialize. You can't develop that kind of breadth if you've decided that, well, I can only be good at one thing and I'm going to be good at one thing.
So we do still have an argument for guys like me who are liberal arts majors.
Well, if you think liberal arts is training to be a generalist, I don't, as it happens. You don't get enough technical education in a curriculum like that.
Well, certainly there's specialization, but it typically tends to be in a social sciences area.
Right, and social sciences are so full of nonsense and bullshit that it's more of a problem than a benefit, in my opinion.
Okay. I think we'll leave that one there.
What's that?
I think we'll leave that topic for now. So, is there anything that you wanted to talk about with regard to education? I'm going to open the Skypecast now for anybody who wants to indicate. There are a couple of people in there, and all you need to do is to flag that you're interested in asking a question. And if you are, let me know and I'll unmute you. Eric, before we do that and close, is there anything else that you wanted to talk about?
Let me think. Any important point that hasn't been hit? I think I'd like to focus in a bit on something else that I talked about in the book, which is Kropotkin's discovery that the principle of command doesn't work. I quoted the anarchist Kropotkin in my book. I don't remember the exact quote, but he said when he was a child, he thought that you could get things done by the principle of command, by ordering people around. People would give orders and they'd be obeyed, and that's how things worked. When he grew up, he discovered that most of the time, human beings just don't function effectively that way. You need people to have individual motivations to do what they're doing. You need consensus. You need organizations where people are all going in the same direction because that's where the individuals want to be going. Command feel less important and a great deal less valuable than we think it is. There's much more that we could do with individualism and voluntary collaboration than we normally do.
I remember reading that quote and being struck by it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, certainly the open source software movement has provided at least for me personally, a fascinating model in how things can get done, and an impressive one. Certainly, not all open source software projects end up succeeding, but those that do sure seem to be able to accomplish some amazing things.
Evolution is a messy process, but it's more successful than planning usually.
Well, Eric, I really appreciate the time. We don't actually have any questions, so I'm going to let you go. But you've been generous in spending time. Thanks for doing so. And if you have any thoughts about open source software and education, I hope you'll communicate with me, and we'll try and find ways to get the word out as to what's going on.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.